Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty vital, I guess you could say. We're talking heart attacks.
Yeah.
And you guys have sent in a ton of research
Right.
about, all the things surrounding them, cardiovascular health in general, but also, what
Yeah.
makes us vulnerable,
Right.
and most importantly, what can we actually do about it?
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, think of this as like your cheat sheet to preventing a heart attack.
Right.
We're going to kind of filter through all of the
Yeah.
often conflicting information out there and focus on what the evidence strongly suggests is really driving the risk. And then what are the things that you can do about it?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I found so interesting just right off the bat from all this research is that maybe we've been kind of
Yeah.
focusing on the wrong thing.
Right.
We've been told for decades now that, cholesterol is a big bad wolf when it comes to heart disease.
Right.
But it seems like there might be a bigger,
Yeah.
a bigger problem lurking out there.
That's a really important point to unpack right away because cholesterol has been the headline for so long,
Yeah.
decades. But in the data that you sent me, elevated blood sugar,
Mm.
the kind that can lead to diabetes, is potentially a far greater risk factor for heart attacks than even smoking.
Wow. So that's like next level because smoking has always been, the just like avoid at all costs kind of thing when it comes to heart health.
Right.
So tell me a little bit more about the blood sugar connection. Like what evidence is there for that?
So there was a study that followed 28,000 women.
Wow.
For over 21 years, these were healthy women at the start of the study. And what this long-term look revealed was that diabetes stood out as the leading risk factor for developing heart attacks, even more significant than something called metabolic syndrome.
Oh yeah, metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
I feel like we hear that term a lot. Can you just give us a quick breakdown of what exactly that means?
Sure. Metabolic syndrome is actually a cluster of conditions that, when they occur together, raise your risk for serious health problems like heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
And it's characterized by having three or more of the following things.
Okay.
A large waistline,
Okay.
which often indicates, excess fat around the abdomen, high blood pressure,
Hmm.
elevated blood sugar levels, high triglycerides,
Hmm.
which are a type of fat found in your blood, and then low levels of what's called HDL cholesterol,
Right. The
uh,
good
the
cholesterol.
so-called good cholesterol.
Yeah.
So if you have, a few of those things going on, that's definitely, something to take note of.
Red flags.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah. So you're saying even with all that going on, diabetes itself is a bigger, even bigger predictor of heart attack risk.
Yeah, that's right. Your sources indicate that while hypertension, high blood pressure is a risk factor we need to pay attention to,
Yeah.
it actually carries less than half the risk of a heart attack compared to type 2 diabetes.
Wow. Okay, so that's like a huge shift in focus then from
Yes.
what we've been thinking about for a while.
Yeah.
So what about family history? That's another thing that we've always been told is like really important. If heart disease runs in your family, you're kind of predisposed to it.
That's right. And that's another area where your sources offer a bit of a nuanced perspective.
Okay.
It appears that while genetics can certainly play a role, having a family history of cardiovascular disease is actually less impactful than those modifiable lifestyle factors we've been talking about,
Okay.
particularly blood sugar control.
Got it.
So the emphasis really comes back to individual actions, the choices you make every single day.
Okay, so that's empowering actually because you're not
Yeah.
doomed by your genetics. You can actually do something about it.
You can.
So, okay, blood sugar, huge, huge factor.
Yeah.
When we get our blood work done,
Yeah.
what are the things, besides just looking at the standard LDL and HDL cholesterol, what are some other things we can look at to kind of get a better picture of our risk for heart attack?
This is where it gets really interesting and potentially very helpful. So while those traditional cholesterol markers still offer, some information,
Yeah.
your sources point to insulin resistance as a very crucial underlying factor in heart attack risk.
Okay.
And there's a specific marker called the LPIR score, which stands for lipoprotein insulin resistance.
I've never even heard of that.
It's not something that's routinely measured.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating here is that an elevated LPIR score
Right.
can indicate a 4 times higher risk of heart attack compared to having just elevated LDL cholesterol alone.
So it's a much better indicator
It could be. It suggests it might be.
than what we've been using.
Yeah.
So how does this LPIR score actually measure insulin resistance?
So lipoproteins are the little packages that carry cholesterol and other fats through your bloodstream.
Okay.
The LPIR score is assessing these lipoproteins in a way that reflects how resistant your body is to the effects of insulin.
Okay.
So while you know a standard glucose test gives you a snapshot of your blood sugar at a particular moment,
Yeah.
even an HbA1c gives you an average over the past, 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
The LPIR score offers another lens by looking at how insulin is interacting with these fat-carrying particles.
So it's really looking at how your body's using that energy.
That's right. And paradoxically, because it's looking at these particles, it can sometimes be a more stable indicator of underlying insulin resistance than direct glucose or insulin measurements, which can fluctuate quite a bit.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So how does this all tie back to, how our body's actually using energy? Like, how does that affect the way our body's processing fat?
Yeah. So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, higher levels of insulin actually tell your body to store energy.
Okay.
And they also prevent it from efficiently burning fat for fuel.
Okay.
So when you become insulin resistant, this process becomes less effective, and your body tends to rely more heavily on carbohydrates for energy,
Okay.
even when there might be plenty of stored fat available.
Got it. Okay. So that's really interesting. So then how does that shift in energy usage impact our cholesterol and other fat levels in our blood?
So this is where we see kind of this domino effect.
Okay.
Increased insulin resistance often leads to higher levels of triglycerides.
Right.
Those are the fats circulating in your blood.
Yeah.
High triglycerides in turn stimulate the liver to produce more VLDL, or very low density lipoprotein.
Yeah.
As VLDL circulates, it gets processed. And this process ultimately contributes to an increase in LDL, that so-called bad cholesterol.
Yeah.
What's particularly concerning here is that insulin resistance tends to favor the production of smaller, denser LDL particles, things like lipoprotein, little a.
Right.
And it also increases apolipoprotein B, which is a key protein component of those bad cholesterol particles.
Okay.
Both of these things are very strongly linked to a higher risk of cardiovascular events.
Got it.
At the same time, insulin resistance often leads to a decrease in HDL, the good cholesterol,
Right.
which plays a protective role.
So it's not just about the overall amount of cholesterol, then it's like the type and the size.
It's the quality of that cholesterol.
Yeah,
And it seems to be all tied back to how our body's responding to insulin.
that's exactly right.
So the practical takeaway regarding
Yeah.
your cholesterol concerns
Yeah.
is that measuring lipoprotein, little a, and apolipoprotein B can give you a much clearer understanding of whether your cholesterol levels are a genuine cause for worry,
In the context of everything else.
in the context of your overall metabolic health.
Got it.
But the overarching message here is to really prioritize blood sugar control.
Okay.
Elevated blood sugar and poor management of carbohydrates in your diet appear to be far more detrimental to your cardiovascular health than high cholesterol in isolation.
Yeah, and you actually gave a stat for that. You said that there's like a 10 times greater risk.
Yeah, your sources state quite clearly that diabetes carries almost 10 times the risk of heart attack compared to elevated LDL cholesterol alone.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's a stark comparison.
So this is really shifting my perspective because I grew up, with that low-fat craze.
Right?
Fat is bad, fat is bad.
Right.
But it sounds like maybe we need to rethink that whole philosophy.
Absolutely. Your sources really challenge those historical low-fat diet recommendations.
Okay.
When researchers have gone back and looked at long-term follow-up data from these large cardiovascular health studies, that initial emphasis on low-fat, high-carbohydrate eating plans doesn't seem to hold up.
Okay, yeah, because I remember there was that huge movement to cut fat out of everything.
Right, get rid of the fat.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that in certain groups, like postmenopausal women, for example,
Okay.
very low-fat diets were actually linked to worsened cardiovascular health outcomes
Oh, wow.
compared to diets that included moderate amounts of healthy fats.
Interesting. Okay.
So it's quite counterintuitive to what many of us were taught.
So cutting fat out drastically could actually backfire.
That's what the findings suggest.
Oh.
That while a low-fat diet might lead to, reduction in LDL cholesterol in some individuals,
Yeah.
over the long term, it didn't consistently translate into a lower risk of heart attack.
Got it.
In fact, in some cases, the risks seem to increase, possibly due to the higher intake of carbohydrates.
Right.
That often accompanies a very low-fat approach, especially if there's underlying insulin resistance present.
So it's really about that balance.
It's about the context
Yeah.
and looking at the whole picture.
So what about statins? Because, we hear so much about those, and I feel like people get put on statins pretty quickly.
Yeah, and this is a really important question to consider.
Mm-hmm.
One of your sources highlights a surprising finding from a major study looking at nutrition and cardiovascular health.
Oh.
They found that participants who were taking statins actually had a 49% higher risk of developing diabetes
Wow.
compared to those who followed the same dietary guidelines but weren't on statins.
So that kind of goes against what we've been told.
It does suggest that while statins are effective at lowering cholesterol, they might not necessarily reduce the overall cardiovascular risk in all individuals, and there could be some unintended metabolic side effects we need to be aware of.
Absolutely. So if we're not going super low fat, what are some of the key dietary takeaways that we can, kind of implement to lower our risk?
Okay, so the emphasis really shifts towards reducing refined carbohydrates.
Okay.
So things like sugary drinks, white bread, processed snacks, those kinds of things.
Okay.
Because these can lead to very rapid spikes in blood sugar.
Mm.
Opting for slower releasing carbohydrates like sweet potatoes,
Mm.
whole grains, and plenty of fiber from vegetables
Right.
is a much better strategy for maintaining stable blood sugar levels.
Okay.
Moderate intake of healthy fats, like those found in avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil, is encouraged.
Yeah.
And it's also important to be mindful of the types of vegetable oils you're using,
Okay.
particularly those that are high in omega-6 linoleic acid
Mm-hmm.
and might be, more prone to oxidation when exposed to heat, potentially contributing to inflammation if not balanced with enough omega-3s.
Got it. So it's not so much about being afraid of fat. It's just about choosing the right fats.
It's about being smart about the types of carbohydrates and fats we're consuming
Yeah.
and really focusing on keeping our blood sugar in a healthy range.
Okay, great. So another interesting thing I read about in these sources is this concept of cardiovascular age,
Yeah.
which is kind of a cool way to think about things.
It is a really insightful way to think about your long-term health.
Yeah.
It's about distinguishing between your chronological age,
Okay.
the number of years you've been alive,
Right.
and the actual functional health of your cardiovascular system.
Okay.
Essentially, good cardiovascular function equates to having a younger cardiovascular age.
So even if you're young, you can have an older cardiovascular age.
Exactly.
It's kind of a weird thought.
Yeah.
So like if somebody is, in their 20s or 30s, but they have a really unhealthy lifestyle, they smoke, they eat poorly, they don't exercise their arteries could actually be like way older than they are chronologically.
Yeah, that's right. Even a young person in their 20s or 30s could, due to factors like smoking a poor diet or a sedentary lifestyle, have arteries that are less flexible
Yeah.
and more prone to problems,
Interesting.
resembling those of someone much older.
So how do we even know like what our cardiovascular age is? How do we measure that?
There's a couple of key indicators that we can look at. One is arterial stiffness.
Okay.
We all know about atherosclerosis,
Yeah.
the buildup of plaque in the arteries.
Yeah.
But arterial stiffening, which is the loss of elasticity and flexibility in the artery walls,
Okay.
is actually an earlier sign that things might not be optimal.
Interesting.
We can get an idea of this through something called pulse wave velocity.
Okay, so is that something that you can only measure like in a doctor's office, or is that something that's becoming more accessible to people?
It is becoming more accessible. So some of the newer smartwatches and wearable rings
Oh, wow.
that use photoplethysmography sensors
Mm.
are now able to estimate your pulse wave velocity.
Oh, that's so cool.
It's not a perfect medical grade measurement,
Yeah, well.
but it can give you a valuable indication of the stiffness of your arteries.
So my smartwatch might be telling me like, hey,
It might do.
your arteries are aging faster than they should.
It's a developing area, but it provides a really interesting insight.
Yeah, okay, that's cool.
Understanding your cardiovascular age based on arterial stiffness can be a key parameter for long-term health and preventing age-related decline. It might even reveal if seemingly healthy habits are inadvertently having a negative impact on your arterial health.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So what about the second way you mentioned to measure cardiovascular age?
So the other crucial aspect is evaluating your cardiovascular capacity. And the gold standard measure for that is VO2 max.
VO2 max. Okay, I've heard of that.
Think of how well your car's engine uses fuel. VO2 max is like measuring how efficiently your body uses oxygen as fuel during intense physical activity. It reflects the overall fitness of your heart, lungs, and blood vessels.
So higher VO2 max score means a younger, more efficient cardiovascular system.
Absolutely.
Well, okay.
While the most accurate way to measure VO2 max is in a lab during a maximal exercise test, there's a more practical field test called the Cooper test.
The Cooper test. Okay.
This involves running for 12 minutes
Okay.
and measuring the maximum distance you can cover.
Okay.
You can then compare your distance to established charts based on your age and sex
Yeah.
to get an estimate of your VO2 max.
Okay, 12 minutes all out. That's a lot.
It does require pushing yourself,
Yeah.
but it provides a really good indication of your aerobic fitness.
Yeah.
And a higher VO2 max is very strongly correlated with greater longevity and better cardiovascular health. In fact, the data show that individuals with very low VO2 max have a 5 times higher risk of death from non-traumatic causes compared to those with high levels of fitness.
Wow, 5 times.
5 times, that's a huge difference.
That's crazy.
And even when we look at older adults,
Hmm.
a study showed a striking difference in 10-year survival rates without chronic illness between the most and least aerobically fit 50-year-olds.
Wow.
Interestingly, even starting to train and improve your fitness in your 50s can reduce your risk of death by about 20%.
That's good news.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so let's say I don't want to run for 12 minutes all out. Is there any other way to kind of gauge my VO2 max?
Yeah, there's a simply walking test you can do.
Okay, tell me about that.
So find a flat, measurable path, a track or even using a GPS app on your phone.
Yeah.
Walk 1 mile as fast as you can,
Okay,
and immediately after you finish, record your time and your heart rate.
got it.
There are online calculators available that can then use, your walking time, your heart rate at the end of the walk your age and your sex
Yeah.
to provide a reasonable estimate of your VO2 max.
Okay.
It's less precise than the Cooper test or lab testing, but it's a much more accessible way to get a sense of your cardiovascular capacity.
So it gives you a starting point.
It does.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about a lot of information here. What are some things that people listening can actually do starting today to improve their cardiovascular health and lower their risk?
Yeah, let's synthesize this into some actual steps you can consider.
Yeah.
Great starting point is paying attention to your hemoglobin A1C.
Okay.
Even if your A1C falls within, quote unquote, the normal range,
Yeah.
your sources suggest that higher levels within that range are still associated with increased cardiovascular risk.
Okay.
Remember, A1C gives you a picture of your average blood sugar levels over the past 2 to 3 months. So it's really reflecting your general dietary patterns.
So the lower end of normal is a better place to be
Yeah,
than
absolutely.
the higher end of normal.
Maintaining stable blood sugar levels and minimizing those rapid spikes in glucose after meals is really crucial for long-term cardiovascular health.
Got it.
If it's something you have access to and you're interested in, consider using a continuous glucose monitor, or CGM.
Yeah.
These devices provide real-time data on your glucose level, which can be incredibly helpful in identifying which foods cause the biggest spikes and in optimizing your overall blood sugar control.
So it really takes the guesswork out of it.
It does.
You can really see like, oh, wow, when I eat that, my blood sugar goes crazy.
That's right.
That's interesting.
For individuals who have been diagnosed with diabetes, especially type 2,
Okay.
prioritizing blood sugar regulation through a lower carbohydrate dietary approach,
Okay.
such as paleo or keto,
Yeah.
can be very effective incorporating intermittent fasting under the guidance of a healthcare professional and with caution for those with type 1 diabetes.
Right.
Can also be a helpful strategy for reducing overall calorie and carbohydrate intake, which can support weight loss and improve insulin sensitivity.
Okay, and what about exercise? It sounds like we should all be thinking about that VO2 max score.
Yes. Aim to incorporate zone 2 aerobic exercise into your routine.
Mm-hmm.
This is that level of activity where you can hold a conversation comfortably. It's very effective for burning fat and improving the foundational fitness of your aerobic system, which in turn helps increase your VO2 max and reduce your cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, I like that you can still talk.
Yeah, you should be able to.
You're not like gasping for air.
If running isn't appealing, consider rocking or weighted marching.
Weighted marching.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly effective way to elevate your heart rate and improve your aerobic fitness through walking.
Oh, that's cool. I've never even heard of that.
Yeah, it's a great low-impact option.
Yeah.
And of course, achieving and maintaining a healthy weight, particularly reducing excess body fat,
Yeah.
has huge benefits.
Right.
It improves your body's ability to use fat for energy, which can help lower triglyceride levels and mitigate those negative effects of insulin resistance.
So it's like everything we've talked about is all connected.
It is.
You're eating well, you're controlling your blood sugar, you're exercising.
Yeah, and if you are dealing with high blood pressure
Yeah.
or you are currently a smoker,
Right.
it's essential to incorporate strategies for managing hypertension and quitting smoking as part of your comprehensive approach to cardiovascular health.
Yeah, so if you're doing all these other things, but you're still smoking, it's not going to do you as much good.
That's right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
these are all great things to think about,
Yeah, and these preventative measures are truly vital for everyone,
not just people who have a problem already.
not just those who currently have diagnosed cardiovascular disease,
Right,
given the widespread impact of these conditions.
right.
Improving these modifiable habits can really enhance your overall quality of life.
So if I had to sum up what I've learned today, it's not so much about obsessing over cholesterol numbers as it's about, really prioritizing blood sugar control and, getting a better sense of my individual cardiovascular health through those markers like LPIR and, maybe measuring my cardiovascular age.
Exactly. Consider making those dietary shifts to better manage your blood sugar. Explore options for assessing your cardiovascular age through pulse wave velocity or estimating your VO2 max, and prioritize incorporating regular Zone 2 exercise into your life.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to chew on.
Yeah.
Considering how big of a problem cardiovascular disease is, what's one small but significant change that you could implement this week
Hmm?
to support your long-term heart health and your overall well-being?
Yeah, I love it.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.